It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. The sun was shining bright, and a light breeze moved through the trees in the backyard. In the midst of the usual hum of suburban life, Claire, a sheriff by profession, was taking the rare opportunity to unwind. It had been a long week. Between managing the responsibilities of her demanding job and trying to maintain some semblance of a personal life, Claire rarely had the time to relax. Today, however, she had decided to take the afternoon off. Her backyard was her sanctuary. The tall wooden fence around the yard provided plenty of privacy, which was exactly what she needed. She had lived here for a few years now, a small but comfortable house with a pool in the back. It was the kind of place where she could just be herself, away from the pressures of the world. She had set up her lounge chair by the pool, wearing a simple swimsuit and sunglasses, ready to soak up some sun. With her legs stretched out on the chair, Claire felt the tension in her muscles begin to melt away. The gentle sound of the water from the pool, along with the rustling of leaves from the trees, made for the perfect backdrop to a peaceful afternoon. In the house next door, things were a little different. The neighbor had been noticing Claire more often lately. They had never spoken, but every now and then they would see her in her backyard working on her garden or having a barbecue with a few friends. From time to time, Claire would be out there with her dog, enjoying the fresh air. But today it was different. Today she was by the pool, lying on a lounge chair looking as if she were completely alone in her world. The neighbor watched through their window, feeling uneasy. There was something about Claire that didn't sit right with them. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or the fact that she was always so relaxed and confident, or maybe it was something else entirely. The neighbor couldn't quite put their finger on it. They had been living next to Claire for over a year now, and while they had seen her around, they didn't know much about her. They had heard people mention her from time to time, mostly because of the uniform she wore when she went to work. Claire was a sheriff, a fact that wasn't exactly common knowledge in the neighborhood. In a small town like this, people tended to keep to themselves, but they also had a way of finding out everything about everyone. The neighbor had learned that Claire was a law enforcement officer shortly after moving in, and while that in itself didn't bother them, something about the whole situation felt off. Perhaps it was the fact that Claire was a black woman. It wasn't something the neighbor had ever fully acknowledged in their mind, but there it was, lurking just beneath the surface. They had grown up in a different part of town, one where things weren't so diverse. Maybe that was why they always felt a bit uncomfortable around Claire, even though she had never given them a reason to feel that way. As Claire lay in her lounge chair, the neighbor's thoughts began to spiral. They had been hearing rumors around town, things about people who didn't quite fit in, who made others uncomfortable without even trying. And Claire, for reasons the neighbor couldn't understand, seemed to be one of those people. It wasn't that she had done anything wrong. No, Claire hadn't done anything at all. But sometimes it only took one little thing to set someone off. The neighbor paced back and forth in their house, glancing out the window every few minutes to check on Claire. There she was, still by the pool, perfectly calm and relaxed. And the longer they watched, the more unsettled they became. It wasn't right, they thought. Someone who didn't belong shouldn't be so comfortable in their own backyard. And then, an idea struck the neighbor, a thought that seemed both simple and powerful. If they called the police, maybe someone could check on Claire, make sure she belonged there. Maybe she was trespassing. Maybe she was up to something that she shouldn't be. Without thinking too much, the neighbor grabbed their phone and dialed the police. The conversation was brief and the request was simple. The neighbor described the situation. A woman was sunbathing by the pool, in a house that didn't seem like hers. It didn't feel right, they explained. The officer on the other end of the line didn't seem too concerned, but they assured the neighbor that someone would come by to check it out. The call ended just as quickly as it had started, and the neighbor put the phone down, a small sense of relief washing over them. It was out of their hands now. Back in the backyard, Claire was still enjoying the quiet afternoon. She had no idea that a call had just been placed or that the events of her peaceful day were about to take a turn. As she leaned back in her chair, Claire glanced at the sky, noticing a few clouds drifting by. It was peaceful here, something that was hard to come by in her line of work. Being a sheriff meant dealing with tense situations, handling difficult people, and constantly being on alert. But here by the pool, she didn't have to think about any of that. She could just be Claire, a woman enjoying a quiet moment, but all of that would soon change. From the corner of her eye, Claire noticed a car pull into the driveway next door. It wasn't uncommon for people to come and go in the neighborhood, but this car seemed to be parked there a little too long. Then she heard the sound of footsteps and a knock on her gate. It was unusual. Claire wasn't expecting any visitors. She stood up from her chair, brushing the sand off her legs, and made her way to the gate. When she opened it, she was met by 2 uniformed officers. "Good afternoon, ma'am," one of the officers said politely. "We received a call about someone suspicious in your yard." "Can you confirm that this is your property?" Claire blinked in surprise. She had never had a run-in with the police in her own neighborhood before, and certainly not while she was just relaxing by her pool. She stood there for a moment, trying to process the situation. Was this some kind of mistake? "Yes, officer," she said, trying to stay calm. "This is my property. I'm just enjoying the day by the pool. Is there something I can help you with?" The officer seemed to hesitate for a moment, then continued. "We just need to make sure everything is in order. Can I see some identification?" Claire wasn't sure what was going on, but she could tell by the officer's serious tone that this wasn't a routine check. She reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet, handing over her ID without a second thought. As the officer examined it, a strange look crossed his face. He glanced at his partner and then back at Claire. There was something about her ID that seemed to have caught his attention. "Wait a second," the officer said, his voice filled with confusion. You're a sheriff?" Claire nodded. "Yes, I am." The officer paused, and the silence between them grew awkward. His partner, who had been standing back, now looked uncomfortable. Claire could see it in their eyes. They had made a mistake. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," the first officer said quickly. "We were just following up on a call." "We didn't realize—" "It's all right," Claire interrupted, maintaining her calm demeanor. She wasn't angry, just a little confused about how a simple afternoon could turn into something so strange. "I understand. No harm done." But in that moment, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. How had this gone so far? How had a peaceful afternoon at home turned into an interaction with law enforcement? All because of one neighbor's suspicion. Little did Claire know, this brief encounter would spark a series of events that would shake her and her community to their core. The air between Claire and the officers hung with an uneasy tension. Though the initial awkwardness had passed, the strange feeling lingered. She stood there in the warm afternoon sun, watching as the 2 officers exchanged glances. Claire, ever the professional, didn't allow herself to show any frustration. Her job as a sheriff had taught her to handle all kinds of situations with patience and composure, but this was different. This wasn't a crime scene or a confrontation in the field. This was her backyard, her sanctuary, and the events unfolding now felt entirely out of place. "Again, I'm sorry, ma'am," the officer who had spoken earlier said, looking somewhat embarrassed. "We were just following up on a call. We didn't realize who we were dealing with." Claire smiled politely, still holding her ground. "It's okay," she said, trying to ease the tension. "I understand you were just doing your job." The second officer, who had been standing quietly to the side, now stepped forward. He looked at Claire more closely, almost as if sizing her up. There was a moment of silence as the 2 men processed the situation, unsure of how to proceed now that they realized they were dealing with one of their own. "We'll make sure to close the report properly," the second officer added, his voice a bit more subdued. "No need for further action. Thank you for your time." Claire nodded but didn't offer a response. She was used to people making mistakes, even those in her line of work. But there was still something about this whole interaction that didn't sit right with her. She could tell that the officers were still processing the fact that they had just approached a fellow law enforcement officer, and she wondered what had really prompted the call in the first place. As the officers turned to leave, Claire couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of confusion. She had been completely unaware that anything was amiss. After all, she had been in her own yard, doing nothing more than enjoying the warmth of the sun. Yet somehow her quiet afternoon had been interrupted by 2 officers, simply because a neighbor had Maddie. A call, but why? What had driven the neighbor to think that something wasn't right? Claire stood at the gate for a few moments longer, watching as the police car slowly pulled out of the driveway. The officers didn't wave or say anything else. It was as if the brief encounter had left them just as unsettled as it had left her. She closed the gate behind her, still lost in thought. The sounds of the neighborhood, which had once seemed so distant and peaceful, now felt oddly oppressive. She returned to her lounge chair, but her mind couldn't shake the feeling that something had been overlooked in this whole ordeal. As the minutes ticked by, Claire found it hard to relax. She picked up her book, but the words seemed to blur together as her thoughts wandered. She found herself wondering about the neighbor. Who had made the call? What had they seen that made them feel so uneasy about her presence? Claire had lived here for quite some time, and while she wasn't close with everyone in the neighborhood, she had never felt anything but acceptance. Sure, there were the usual quiet interactions, the polite waves when passing by, but that was about it. There had never been any sense of tension. So why now? The afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the backyard. Claire stood up, feeling the weight of the situation slowly settling in. She needed to take action, to understand why this had happened. She couldn't just let it slide as if nothing had occurred. Turning back toward the house, Claire grabbed her phone and dialed the number of a colleague at the local precinct. "Hey, it's Claire," she said when the call was answered. "I need to ask you something. There was a situation today. The police came by my house on a call. A neighbor said they saw something suspicious in my yard. Can you check if there's anything I should know?" Her colleague, a woman she trusted, took a few moments to check the records. "I'll get back to you in a second," she said, before Claire heard the sound of typing in the background. After a brief pause, the voice on the other end returned. "Okay, I found it. It was a call made by someone from your neighborhood, but the report was vague. They said they saw a person they didn't recognize around their neighbor's yard and felt uncomfortable. Nothing specific, just odd vibes, I guess." Claire frowned. "That's it? No details, nothing concrete?" "Nothing. Just that they thought someone was loitering. I can pull up more details if you want, but it doesn't seem like there was any cause for concern. It sounds like a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. It seemed too simple an explanation, especially after the officers had shown up at her house." Claire felt a flicker of something deep inside her, a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Can you keep an eye on it for me?" she asked. "I don't want this to escalate if it doesn't need to, but I also need to know what this person is thinking." "Of course," her colleague replied. "I'll check back in soon." Claire ended the call and set the phone down on the table. She had a feeling that the situation wasn't going to just fade away. Whoever had called the police might have thought it was a simple mistake, but Claire knew better. People didn't act this way without reason, and she had a nagging suspicion that something more was at play here. She couldn't shake the idea that the call was not just about a misunderstanding or a simple case of someone not recognizing a neighbor. No, there had to be more to it. She wondered if there was something about her, something about the way she looked that made her seem out of place in her own neighborhood. Claire had spent a lot of her life trying to avoid the assumptions that came with her appearance. She was used to people making snap judgments, whether they were conscious of it or not. It was a reality she had learned to navigate with grace and patience, but today had been different. Today she had been confronted with those assumptions in a way that was impossible to ignore. As the evening set in, Claire decided to go for a walk. She needed some time to clear her mind and think things through. She put on a light jacket and left the house, her feet carrying her down the quiet streets of her neighborhood. It was strange, but the peaceful surroundings felt less comforting now. The houses seemed too close, the streets too narrow. As she walked, she couldn't stop replaying the incident in her mind. The officers had been polite, yes, but the entire situation had left her feeling unsettled. Why had they been so quick to act on the call? Why hadn't they thought to question the motives of the neighbor who had made it? Why hadn't they simply asked around to see if anyone knew her? The more she walked, the more Claire realized that it wasn't just the police she had to worry about. It was the people around her, the ones who looked but never saw. She didn't want to assume the worst, but she couldn't ignore the facts. The simple act of being in her own backyard had led to an unnecessary confrontation. And while she could brush it off as a misunderstanding, the truth was that something deeper was going on. By the time Claire returned home, she knew she wouldn't be able to put this behind her. She had to understand why this had happened and what she could do to make sure it never happened again. It wasn't just about the misunderstanding. It was about something much bigger. The rest of the night was quiet, but Claire couldn't sleep. The questions swirled in her mind, and the feeling that something had shifted in her relationship with her community only grew stronger. It was clear that the story wasn't over yet. The next morning, Claire woke up earlier than usual. The sun had just started to peek through the blinds, casting soft light across the room. The events from the previous day were still fresh in her mind. It wasn't that she hadn't had her share of strange encounters. Working as a sheriff meant dealing with difficult situations all the time. But this was different. This wasn't a case of chasing down criminals or managing a chaotic scene. This was a quiet, personal moment that had been interrupted for reasons she couldn't fully understand. As she sat on the edge of her bed, Claire found herself reflecting on the neighbor who had made the call. She still had no idea who they were. The call had come in anonymously, and neither of the officers had provided any details about the person behind it. Was it someone who had lived there for a long time? Or perhaps a new neighbor? Claire couldn't be sure. All she knew was that the person's perception of her being out of place in her own yard, had set everything in motion. Claire got out of bed and headed to the kitchen. She needed to start her day, but the thoughts swirling in her head made it difficult to focus. She had always tried to be kind and approachable with her neighbors, even if they weren't the most talkative bunch. Her line of work required her to interact with a wide variety of people, and she had learned to navigate different personalities. But this felt different. This felt like something that wasn't just about misunderstandings or assumptions. As she brewed her coffee, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from her colleague who had looked into the call. "Claire, I checked out the neighbor who called in. It's the couple who moved in a few months ago. Haven't seen much interaction with other neighbors. I'm digging into it more, but I wanted to give you a heads up." Claire felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, she was glad to have some answers, but on the other, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The couple had only moved in recently, which meant they hadn't had much time to establish any kind of relationship with her or the other residents. Still, it wasn't enough information to fully explain why they would feel the need to call the police over something so minor. She sent a quick reply. "Thanks for the update. Keep me posted on what you find out." After finishing her coffee, Claire decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The fresh air would help clear her head. It had been a while since she had really taken the time to just walk around and observe. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate her neighborhood, but as a sheriff, she was always on alert. Walking through her own streets felt like stepping into someone else's world. As she walked past the other houses, Claire's thoughts drifted back to the call. What could have caused the neighbor to feel that way? She wasn't doing anything suspicious, not in the least. She was simply enjoying her day in her own home. But what if the neighbor didn't see it that way? What if there was something about her presence that made them uncomfortable? Claire had spent a lot of time thinking about the way people saw her. Growing up, she had learned that people didn't always see her for who she was. Sometimes the color of her skin or her profession was all they focused on. It wasn't something that she let affect her work or her sense of self-worth. But moments like this made her question whether she was truly being seen for who she was, or if she was being judged based on assumptions. As she continued her walk, Claire passed by the couple's house. It was a modest home, but well kept. There were no signs of life, no cars in the driveway, no movement behind the curtains. It seemed eerily quiet. Claire wondered if they were home or if they were out running errands. She didn't want to make any assumptions about them, but she couldn't help the nagging feeling in her gut. She felt the need to address the situation. She had to know why they had called the police. The walk had given her a lot to think about, but it hadn't brought her any closer to answers. Claire's instincts told her that this wasn't just about the call, it was about something deeper. Something that went beyond a simple misunderstanding. When she returned home, she stood in front of her house for a moment, taking in the familiar view. It was hard to shake the feeling that things had changed, even though nothing outwardly had. She was still in the same house, in the same neighborhood, doing the same work. But somehow everything felt different. As she walked inside, her phone buzzed again. It was another message from her colleague. "Claire, I've got some more info on the neighbors. They've been pretty isolated since they moved in. Don't interact much with the community, but they've made a few comments about people not belonging in the neighborhood. I think they might have some biases." Claire's stomach tightened. The pieces were starting to come together, but it wasn't a picture she was eager to see. It was one thing to be the target of a misunderstanding, but another to realize that the misunderstanding might be based on something much more personal. bias, and prejudice. She sat down at the kitchen table trying to process the information. The idea that the neighbor might have seen her as an outsider because of her race was a hard pill to swallow. Claire had dealt with prejudice in various forms throughout her life, but to face it so directly in her own neighborhood, it stung. It wasn't the kind of thing she could easily brush off. But Claire wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She had worked hard to earn her position, and she had always stood up for herself and others when it mattered. This situation was no different. If the neighbor's call had been based on something other than a simple mistake, then Claire needed to confront it. She couldn't let it slide, not when it might send the wrong message. After a few moments, Claire made a decision. She was going to talk to the neighbor directly. She wasn't sure what she would say yet, but she knew that avoiding the situation wasn't an option. She had to face this head-on. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Claire went about her usual tasks, but her mind kept returning to the conversation she was going to have with the neighbor. She wasn't looking for a confrontation, but she needed to hear their side of the story. She needed to understand why they felt the way they did. As evening approached, Claire stood in front of her door trying to summon the courage to walk next door. She had no idea how the conversation would go, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was something she had to do. With a deep breath, Claire walked down the front steps of her house and crossed the yard to the neighbor's door. She knocked softly, trying to keep her approach non-threatening. When the door opened, the couple stood before her. The man looked surprised to see her, and the woman's expression was unreadable. "Hello," Claire said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm Claire. I live next door. I wanted to talk to you about something that happened yesterday." The man shifted on his feet, looking uncomfortable. Sure. "Come on in," he said, stepping aside. Claire entered, feeling a mix of anticipation and apprehension. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this conversation would be crucial. "Look," Claire began, "I just want to understand what happened yesterday. I was enjoying a quiet afternoon by my pool, and someone called the police. I'm just trying to figure out why." The woman spoke up, her voice hesitant. "We didn't mean any harm, we saw you out there and we didn't recognize you. It felt strange." "Strange?" Claire repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "How?" the man sighed. "It's not like we wanted to cause trouble. We just thought maybe someone was trespassing or something wasn't right." Claire could feel her frustration rising, but she kept it in check. "I live here," she said firmly. "I've lived here for years. I wasn't doing anything wrong." The woman looked at the floor, and the man seemed to regret his words. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I guess we were just being cautious." But Claire wasn't satisfied with that explanation. "Being cautious is one thing," she said, "but calling the police on your neighbor? You have to think about why that happened. Was it just because I was unfamiliar to you? Or was there something else?" There was silence for a long moment as the couple exchanged looks. Claire could see the hesitation in their eyes, the discomfort of facing someone who wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let them hide behind excuses. "Look," Claire continued, "I understand that people don't always feel comfortable with things they don't understand. But I need you to understand something. Just because I'm here living my life doesn't mean I'm out of place. This is my home, just like it's yours." The couple didn't respond right away, but after a long pause, the man spoke, his voice quieter now. "We didn't mean to make you feel like you don't belong." "We're sorry," Claire nodded, her expression softening slightly. It wasn't the apology she had hoped for, but it was a start. It was a moment of honesty, even if it had taken a little prodding to get there. She left their house feeling drained, but somehow relieved. The conversation hadn't solved everything, but it had opened the door to understanding, however imperfectly. Claire stood in front of the neighbor's house, her mind still processing everything that had just happened. The conversation had been short but intense, and she could feel the weight of it lingering in the air. The couple's apology, while sincere, hadn't fully erased the discomfort she felt. Yes, they had admitted to making a mistake, but there was something more, something unspoken that still hung between them. As she walked back to her own house, Claire's thoughts swirled around the situation. It wasn't just about the call or the awkwardness of the encounter with the police. It was about what had led to it in the first place. Assumptions. The neighbor hadn't recognized her, and in their eyes that made her an outsider. They hadn't taken the time to understand who she was or to even consider the possibility that she was simply enjoying a quiet afternoon in her own backyard. No, instead they had acted on something deeper, a feeling, a gut reaction. And that reaction had sent the police to her door. But Claire wasn't the type to dwell on anger. Her role as a sheriff had taught her to deal with difficult situations with calm and patience. She had learned to compartmentalize her emotions, to focus on finding solutions rather than just sitting with the problem. Still, this was different. The feeling of being misunderstood was a hard one to shake, and it wasn't something she could simply let go of. She had to confront it head on, not just for her own peace of mind, but for the future of her neighborhood. When she returned home, she noticed that the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She took a deep breath, trying to ground herself in the moment. The house was quiet, just the way she liked it, but there was a sense of unease that hung in the air. She felt like an outsider in her own life, something she wasn't used to. Claire sat on her porch for a while, sipping on a cold drink, her eyes scanning the neighborhood. It was peaceful, but there was an underlying tension that she couldn't ignore. The walk she had taken earlier had made her realize something important. People didn't always see her for who she was. They saw the uniform, they saw the badge, they saw what they wanted to see. But the real Claire, the one who just wanted to enjoy a quiet afternoon to be like everyone else, that version of herself was lost in the noise. As she sat there lost in thought, Claire's phone buzzed on the table beside her. It was a message from her colleague again. "Claire, I've got some more info. Looks like the neighbor who called isn't new to the area. They've been here for a few years, but they've kept to themselves. They don't really interact with the other neighbors, and their previous interactions have been distant. They've made comments about people who don't fit in." Claire sighed, the weight of the words sinking in. It wasn't just an isolated incident. There was something deeper going on. These weren't just random actions. They were part of a bigger pattern. The neighbor's discomfort with Claire wasn't just because she was unfamiliar. It was because she didn't fit their idea of what belonged in their neighborhood. It stung, but Claire wasn't surprised. She had seen it before, in different forms, in different places. People often didn't like things that were unfamiliar. They didn't like change, and they certainly didn't like feeling like their world was being upended by someone they didn't understand. But Claire didn't want to let that hold her back. She had faced challenges her entire life, both personally and professionally. She had fought to earn her place in this world, and she wasn't about to let a neighbor's assumptions define her. She had built her career with integrity and hard work, and she had built her life here with the same principles. This was her home, and she wasn't going anywhere. She responded to her colleague's message. "Thanks for the update. I'll handle it from here." After putting her phone down, Claire's mind began to race again. She couldn't let this situation just fade away. She needed to make sure that her neighbors understood that she wasn't an outsider, that she wasn't someone to be feared or misunderstood. She needed to find a way to bridge the gap between herself and the community, especially with those who might still view her with suspicion. The next few days passed in a blur of routine for Claire. She went to work, handled the usual calls, and tried to keep her mind occupied. But the feeling of being judged, of being seen as different, never fully left her. There were moments when she would catch herself thinking about the incident, replaying the conversation with the neighbor over and over again in her mind. Claire knew that she had to confront this issue head on, but she wasn't sure how. She didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. But at the same time, she couldn't let the discomfort of a few misguided people dictate how she lived her life. One evening, while sitting in her living room, she finally decided what needed to be done. It wasn't enough to just talk to the neighbor who had called the police. Claire needed to talk to the whole neighborhood. She needed to let them see her for who she truly was, not just as a sheriff, but as a person. She needed them to understand that their assumptions were wrong, and that their discomfort wasn't something she could ignore. She pulled out a pen and a piece of paper, drafting a short letter that she would hand-deliver to each house in the neighborhood. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined. She didn't want to create more conflict, but she knew this was the only way to move forward. The letter was simple but heartfelt. "Dear neighbor, I wanted to take a moment to introduce myself and clarify something that happened recently. Some of you may have heard about the incident that occurred when the police were called to my home. I understand that it may have caused some confusion or concern, and I want to address that. I am a sheriff in this community, and I've lived here for several years. My goal is to always be a good neighbor, and to contribute to our community in a positive way. I understand that sometimes things can seem unfamiliar or out of place, but I assure you that I am not someone to be feared or misunderstood. If you ever have any questions or concerns, or if you just want to chat, please don't hesitate to reach out. I would love the opportunity to get to know all of you better, and to ensure that we can live in a community where everyone feels safe and respected. Thank you for your understanding. Sincerely, Claire folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the right step forward. She didn't know how the neighbors would respond, but at least she was doing something. It was time to take control of her own narrative. Over the next few days, Claire walked door to door delivering the letters to each house in the neighborhood. Some neighbors greeted her with warm smiles, while others looked surprised to see her, but no one turned her away. There were a few moments of awkward silence, but Claire didn't mind. She knew that this was something that had to be done, even if it wasn't going to be easy. By the end of the week, Claire had delivered every letter. The weight that had been hanging over her slowly began to lift. It wasn't an immediate fix, but it was a start. She had opened the door to communication, and now it was up to the community to decide how they wanted to respond. A few days later, she received a text from her colleague, who had been checking in on the situation. "Hey Claire, I spoke to a few people in the neighborhood. They appreciated the letter. Some of them didn't realize what happened, and a few even apologized for not reaching out sooner." Claire smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't the resolution she had expected, but it was enough. People were starting to see her for who she truly was, not just as a sheriff, but as a neighbor, as someone who belonged. The journey was far from over, but Claire knew that she had taken the first step toward healing and understanding. The road ahead might still be uncertain, but she was no longer the outsider she had once felt like. She was part of this community, and she wasn't going to let anyone's assumptions change that. It had been a week since Claire had delivered the letters to her neighbors. The weight of the situation still hung in the air, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been before. She had taken the step of reaching out, of opening the door for conversation, and while it wasn't a magic fix, it was progress. The silence from the neighborhood had been replaced with small moments of change, a wave here, a smile there. The shift was slow, but it was happening. Claire spent the next few days continuing with her routine. She went to work, helped with community outreach, and spent time at home enjoying the solitude that she had once taken for granted. Despite the tension that had clouded her mind for days, there was a subtle sense of calm settling back into her life. She was starting to feel like herself again, even though she knew the work wasn't over. One afternoon, as she was cleaning up her kitchen, there was a knock at the door. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone, but the timing of the knock felt important. She walked to the door and opened it slowly. Standing there was the neighbor who had made the call. The man, his hands in his pockets, looked a little hesitant. Claire felt a mix of emotions, but she kept her expression neutral, not wanting to make him feel uncomfortable. "Hi," he said quietly, looking down at his feet before looking up at her. "Can we talk?" Claire nodded, stepping aside to allow him in. "Of course," she replied, her voice calm. The man stepped inside and they both sat down in her living room. Claire waited for him to speak, knowing that this moment had been a long time coming. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was ready for whatever he had to say. "I just wanted to apologize," the man began, his voice low. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realized that I overreacted. I shouldn't have called the police on you. That was wrong." Claire sat still, absorbing his words. "I appreciate you saying that," she said after a moment. "It wasn't easy, but I'm glad you reached out." He sighed, clearly struggling with something. "It's just that I've been living in this neighborhood for a long time, and I've always kept to myself. I don't know a lot of people here. I guess I'm not used to seeing someone like you." Claire didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. She understood what he was saying. People's biases often went unspoken, but they were there, lingering beneath the surface. She could hear it in his words, even though he was trying to be honest. It wasn't just her presence that had unsettled him. It was everything about her. Everything that didn't fit with his idea of what belonged. "I know that's not an excuse," he continued, his voice shaking a little. "I don't want to be that person who judges someone based on what they look like or where they come from. But I guess I just didn't know how to react. And that's on me." Claire nodded, her gaze steady. She didn't feel angry, just tired. Tired of the assumptions, tired of the need for people to put others in boxes. It wasn't easy to be the one who constantly had to prove they belonged. "I understand," she said softly. "But I want you to understand something too. I've worked hard to get where I am, to be a part of this community. And I don't want to feel like an outsider in my own home. None of us should." The man sat in silence for a moment, his head lowered in thought. Claire could see the shame on his face, and she knew that this wasn't easy for him. It wasn't easy for her either. But this was the conversation that had to happen. "I know," he said finally, lifting his eyes to meet hers. "And I'm sorry. I want to do better. I want to be better." For a moment, Claire didn't know how to respond. She wasn't looking for an apology. She was looking for change. And though it was a small step, she could see that he was genuinely trying to understand. That meant something. "I appreciate that," Claire said after a long pause, "and I think we all have to do better. I'm not perfect either. I don't always know how to connect with everyone, but we can try, right?" He nodded, his eyes softening. "Yeah, we can try." There was a silence between them, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind that had filled the air when he first arrived. This one felt different. It felt like a beginning, a small step toward understanding. Claire didn't expect everything to change overnight, but at least they were talking. At least they were acknowledging the problem. That was more than she could have asked for just a few days ago. When the conversation came to an end, the man stood up to leave. "Thanks for listening," he said, his voice quieter now. "And thanks for not giving up on me." Claire smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "You're welcome. We all make mistakes. It's how we learn from them that matters." As the door closed behind him, Claire stood still for a moment, her hand resting on the knob. She had hoped for this, hoped that the neighbor would understand. And while it wasn't a perfect resolution, it was a step in the right direction. There was still work to be done, but this felt like a turning point. Over the next few weeks, things in the neighborhood began to change. The atmosphere lightened, and the interactions between neighbors became more open. Claire didn't feel the same tension she had once felt when walking past people. There were more nods, more friendly waves, small gestures that showed that the walls between her and the rest of the community were slowly crumbling. It wasn't just the neighbor who had apologized, it was everyone. People who had once kept their distance now made an effort to reach out, to acknowledge her presence. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. It was the kind of progress that made Claire believe that change, even if it was slow, was possible. One afternoon, as Claire was gardening in her front yard, a neighbor she hadn't spoken to much before approached her. The woman smiled, holding a plate of freshly baked cookies in her hands. "Hi there, Claire," she said warmly. "I just wanted to stop by and say thank you. I know it's been a weird few weeks, but I've noticed the changes around here, and I wanted to say that I see you. I see who you are." Claire was taken aback by the woman's words, but she felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you," she said, accepting the plate of cookies with a smile. "That means a lot." The woman's smile grew. "It's not always easy to do the right thing, but I think we're all trying to be better in our own ways." And in that moment, Claire realized something important. Change didn't happen because of grand gestures or big speeches. It happened in small moments of understanding. It happened when people were willing to look beyond their biases and see each other as human beings. It happened when people made the choice to do better. The following weeks were filled with more conversations, more small acts of kindness. The neighbor who had once made the call had invited Claire over for coffee, and they spent hours talking about everything from their childhoods to their hopes for the future. It wasn't a perfect friendship, but it was a start. And that was enough. Claire knew that there would always be challenges, that there would always be people who didn't understand or who made assumptions. But she also knew that she didn't have to face those challenges alone. The community she had once felt disconnected from was slowly coming together, and she was a part of it. She belonged, and in the end, that was all she had ever wanted.